My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Ovid, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cayuga and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is January 7th, 2021, and I am interviewing Bill Barton of Bellweather Hard Cider and Wine Cellars. Good morning, Bill.
Hi, how are you today?
Oh, good, very good. Thank you. Thank you for participating. So could you tell me your full name?
Yes, my name is William Thomas Barton.
And could you tell me the name of the company?
The company is officially Barton's Hard Cider, LLC, but the DBA we operate under is Bellweather Hard Cider and Wine Cellars. And that's in part because the name Barton, I couldn't use that in the alcohol business without encouraging many lawyers to complain about it.
And so where are you located? In Seneca County?
We're just in Seneca County at 9070 State Route 89, which is about 5 miles north of Taganic State Park.
Okay, right on the border on the western shore of Kegel Lake, right?
Yeah, we're on Kegel
The
Lake.
border of Seneca and Tompkins counties.
Yes.
Okay, and so where were you from originally, born and raised?
I grew up in New Jersey, about 25 miles outside of New York City.
And could you tell me about your background, your education?
Yes, I was trained in earth sciences. I attended Amherst College as a geology and physics student, and then came to Cornell in geophysics. And from there, I actually went into the oil and gas industry in Houston.
Wow.
And went back ultimately for graduate studies in resource economics at Penn State.
And so when did you move to the Ithaca area?
I've lived here twice. I lived here as a student back in the 70s, late 70s, mid-late 70s. But then I moved back here, I'd say permanently, since I've been here for 30 plus years now, in 1987.
Okay. So did you have any specific education in cider making or wine making?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
Yeah, I started brewing beer in Ithaca. There was a very good home brewers group, and I started making beer. And as part of that, I also was doing some cider. But I literally went from a 5-gallon batch as a home brewer cider maker to a 1,500-gallon batch.
Wow. And so when did you make the complete career move or change?
Well,
or have you retired from your previous?
No, I still do several other things besides this, but I guess I really started working on this more or less full-time in 1994. And it took me several years. I was writing business plans and doing all the due diligence stuff you do when you try to set up a business. And so that took about 2 years, and I more officially started in 1996.
Okay. And where were you located at that point?
Well, at that point, we rented space in a very large commercial building in Ithaca on Route 96, the old Babcock chicken hatchery.
Right.
So lots of eggshells in the drains.
And does anyone in your family have a background in agriculture, or this
No.
is just all?
No.
This is just you. And I think I read that you and your wife had traveled to France and England and were interested in cider making at that point as
Yeah, it
well.
was one of those moments that you get where we were drinking cider regularly, and particularly in France, and just started wondering out loud, why wasn't there more of a cider industry in the U.S., since we clearly have lots of apples? And it was sheer ignorance. I really didn't know anything about the historical nature of cider in the United States. And it wasn't until after I actually started doing it that I became more acquainted with that history.
And so how many, what types of ciders are you producing? And, what did you start out with, first of all?
Well, the cider is, as is the case with grape wine, is a function of the fruit that you have available. And in the beginning, the easiest fruit to get my hands on was the most common, which was basically dessert fruit, apple varieties that the average American, certainly in this part of the country, would be well aware of from their grocery stores and from the sweet cider that they might be consuming. So that's kind of what I started with. And since then, as is the case with most of the industry, I've branched out into heirloom varieties and also European traditional cider varieties.
Do you have any acres of orchards yourself, or do you primarily buy the fruit?
Well, we do primarily buy fruit. We buy all of our grapes, but we do have a small apple orchard.
You moved to this building in 2003, is that correct? And
Yes.
where is that located?
Well, this location is right on Route 89, and we moved to this location for the proximity to the Cayuga Lake Wine Trail. In our old location, we had joined the wine trail, but
Okay.
we were literally in a geographic location that made us just barely in the appellation. So, and we were far enough away from the other members that we really didn't get a lot of the benefit of
Right.
their proximity. So our goal was to move over to Route 89, and I literally drove up and down this road and put flyers in every single mailbox. If I saw a farmer out in the field, I would stop and walk over and ask them if they had any land for sale. I got some of the local postmen quite mad with me for putting all those flyers in the boxes, but it did ultimately work out. I had somebody who gave me a call and said, well, I've got some acreage that I think I'd like to sell, and so that's why we ended up where we are.
Right, and you mentioned the Cayuga Wine Trail, which is the first and oldest trail in America, from what I understand.
That's correct, yeah.
So that's extremely, promotion is very important in the product. So can you describe the step-by-step process of making cider?
Yes, it's for anyone who's at all familiar with winemaking, you're essentially making wine. The only difference is the fruit. And so basically you're starting with fresh fruit, and it's got to be squished and turned into juice. And once you have juice, then you may or may not do any pre-fermentation treatment of it. Some people will add sulfite, some will settle it, and so forth. But ultimately, you're preparing the juice for fermentation. And at that point, you have two options. You can either add a cultured yeast, which is what most winemakers are doing, or cider makers, or you can just let it spontaneously ferment using whatever's in the environment.
And I think I read you use wild yeast. Is that?
We
talk
use
about that?
wild yeast a lot with our wines,
Okay.
but at the moment I'm using cultured yeast primarily for the ciders.
And
That's an interesting question, because at some point I probably will be doing more with wild yeast on the ciders.
okay. And I think I read that you store your apples for a little bit longer to increase the sugar. Is that a process?
I mean, a lot of cider makers will, what they call, kind of sweat the fruit. They put them in storage and let them rest. And it will have the benefit of maybe more completely converting starches to sugars. But really, a lot of times the fruit is just being stored because you don't have the time or the tank capacity to process it. So I can't say that any of our storage is really a strategy based on production benefits.
Oh, okay.
It's much more a strategy based on, do you have the time, do you have the tanks, and do you have the money to buy the fruit?
And you also, can you tell me about some of the apples that you use specifically?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, we started out using a lot of dessert apples and then added in heirloom varieties and European varieties. The current thinking in the cider industry is that you really shouldn't be using a lot of dessert apples. I don't really subscribe to that. I think that that's a bit of snobbery on the part of many of the cider geeks. I think that an apple's an apple. Some are better than others for making cider, and you just have to experiment with fruit and find out what works. I do tend to prefer, as a group, the heirloom varieties. A lot of people prefer the flavor profile of the European fruit. But the big difference there is the European fruit tends to be high in tannin and relatively low in acid. The North American heirloom fruit tends to be higher in acid and lower in tannin. I personally just prefer the flavor profiles from the heirloom fruit.
So you're not in any abandoned orchards looking for...
Well, that's not a bad way to find some of those heirloom varieties. But I'd prefer a little bit more control. I mean, it got to be fairly fashionable to go out and forage fruit. And there's a couple guys that I know that have done it that have been very successful in promoting it as something unusual or desirable. And I got to give them credit, because it's mostly a sales pitch.
It would be, I would think, a very unpredictable production level, because it would be hard to count on the volume of apples you would need if that's how you...
Well, and I think
focus.
the people that are really dedicated to foraging, if they don't do it contractually, they may make long-term arrangements with people who own land and will allow them year after year to come pick. Now, again, that doesn't guarantee that there will always be fruit every year, but at least it kind of gives them access year after year on a very consistent basis.
So I also wanted to ask, what is forced carbonation?
Well, there's two ways to put bubbles into a cider or a wine, and one is the traditional champagne method, where you are actually using a secondary fermentation that takes place in the bottle. The bottle is sealed and you don't let the carbon dioxide from the fermentation escape. And that becomes the sparkle that we're used to in a traditional champagne. But in many carbonated beverages, certainly things like sodas, beer, and many wine type beverages, you can add carbonation in a way that's called forced carbonating, where you actually, like you would have in an aquarium, you have a stone that goes into a tank full of your beverage, and you chill the tank and then bubble through carbon dioxide over a period of time until it's absorbed into the beverage at the level you want it.
Is ancestral? What is that?
Pardon?
Method ancestral? I'm not
Well,
sure.
There's a bunch of terms that are out there. Method champenoise is the traditional champagne method. There's method ancestral or method artisanal, which is what we have been doing for some of our ciders, which is really mostly the same as the champagne method, with the exception that you don't, at the bitter end, disgorge the sediment from that secondary fermentation, which is a labor-intensive and or gizmo-intensive. It's a process that will eliminate any sediment from the bottle, and it is traditional for champagnes, but it becomes a more expensive process.
Okay, and you blend other fruits with your ciders, correct?
We've done 2 or 3 ciders that we've used additional fruit, and that's something that some of the purists would consider heresy, but
A cherry? Is it?
yeah, we use a Montmorency sour cherry with one of our ciders. We also use black currant in another. And we've done raspberry in a very limited production run. And they're very popular with consumers. So, and apple is a great base flavor. There's many things that we consume where apple is a part of it. And the alcoholic beverage area is no different. It's a great base flavor.
And so what would you consider, I know you have many, your flagship cider?
Well, interestingly, the first cider we came out with, we just called our original. And it was a big blend of dessert fruit. And in some ways, I'd consider that sort of a flagship cider. It may be more akin to what the beer industry would call one of their session beers, so that it might be a session cider. It's not overly complex. It's pretty easy drinking, not super high in alcohol, just a very pleasant, very food-friendly cider.
And what is the alcohol level generally in cider? About 6%, I heard.
Yeah, it really depends a lot on where you are and the fruit you're using. A lot of the fruit that we grow in upstate New York would typically give you alcohol levels that would be in the 5 to 7% range. There are some varieties that will get you higher alcohol, but there are some legal limits that may cause you to run into trouble. And there are certainly people who will try to boost the alcohol by adding sugar. And a lot of the old farmyard ciders were big proponents of that. They would add all sorts of things. They would add dried fruit like raisins. They'd add brown sugar. molasses, just anything to boost the alcohol. And in large part, I think some of those older techniques were an attempt to provide stability for the product. Because again, obviously you're producing cider from one harvest, and you're not going to have another chance until the next harvest. Mm-hmm. So you would like that cider to not turn to vinegar or something else that you don't find desirable to drink. And the best way to do that, particularly in the days of old, were to boost the alcohol content.
To preserve the apples initially, correct, in history?
Yeah, it's a great preservative.
So do you recall the number of bottles or cases you produced when you opened in 96? Tough question.
Well, and it was also interesting to think about that because our initial production was put into beer bottles, so 12-ounce bottles, as opposed to what we're currently doing where everything is in 750 milliliter wine bottles. So it is literally apples and oranges.
Okay.
But, I mean, our production initially was, we were doing batches that were roughly 1,000 gallons at a time. So if you put that into wine bottles, that's roughly 600 cases.
And what is the current production for just the cider part
The
of
cider
the
we
business?
probably are doing 4,000 or 5,000 cases, wine bottle cases annually.
Okay, so, and then you went into winemaking as well. When did you begin that process?
Well, that process was motivated by the fact that my daughter married a winemaker, and he was interested in creating his own label. So we had the licensing to do it, and we had excess capacity, and most of the things that we used for making cider were applicable to making wine. I mean, the stainless steel tank doesn't care whether you're putting cider or grape juice into it. It's going to operate the same way. So 2012 was, I think, the first real vintage year that we had.
And I understand you're branching off into distillery.
We're hoping to, yeah. We, again, thinking back to Europe and sort of some of the cider making there, particularly in places like Normandy and Brittany, there's a huge cider history. And in parallel to the cider making is the making of spirits, particularly Calvados. So they're basically taking their hard ciders and distilling them into apple spirits, apple brandies, if you like. And I'd had an opportunity to try some of these and really enjoyed them and thought that would be a great extension of what we're currently doing. And for years, I sort of toyed with the idea, and finally I made friends with a local person who runs a winery called Ports of New York, a Frenchman who grew up in Normandy. And I would constantly ask him, I'd say, you must know somebody back in France that has one of those old pot stills that is just sitting there not doing anything. And he kept telling me no. And then one day he called me up and he said, yeah, the village I grew up in, my father, who still is there, said that the old manor house that's there, the current owner had found an old still in one of their attics and was willing to sell it. So
I think I've seen the beautiful copper.
yeah, it's really a pretty, it's it's really a pretty still. And well, I wouldn't have gotten it if this guy from Ports of New York wasn't involved, because the paperwork to get it out of France and to get it imported into the U.S. required way more French than I was capable of producing. So we ultimately got it, and it's here, and now we have to go through the process of licensing it and begin production. So it's a longer term project.
Yeah, I think I've had dessert wines, I think in Provence or Spain, that were apple based. Is that something is it be more a dessert wine as well?
No. I mean, the Calvados itself is, and again, I think you drink it more like a cocktail. There are certainly people who would drink it as dessert. We have made one product so far. It's called a pommeau, which is more akin to, I think, what you're referring to. And it's a product where you take some apple distillate. So you take the hard cider and you distill that down to like an apple brandy, but more or less like an eau de vie, so a clear liquid. And you blend that with unfermented cider and age it for a while and then bottle it. And it's much lower in alcohol than a Calvados.
Okay.
But it's higher than cider and most grape wine. So it's typically in the 16 to 17% range. And it's sweet because you blended it with unfermented juice.
And you mentioned your daughter and son-in-law. So how many people are employed in the production of cider and wine here at Bellweather?
Right now, one.
And I'm looking at him.
You're looking at me.
That's right.
Yeah, both my daughter and son-in-law had worked in the business, and they no longer do.
Oh, okay.
And I will get other people in to help me occasionally. My son will help me, or I'll hire somebody to come in, for example, when we bottle, and we need 2 or 3 people to do that.
Okay. And the last question, or COVID, how has that impacted your business?
Well, I'm sure like everyone else, it has been problematic. I mean, we were always open, but the first few months, there was virtually nobody coming in. Occasionally somebody who had a lake house and lived out of the area and had decided to come up here to shelter would come in and buy a couple bottles or maybe even a case and go back down to the lake house and stay away from everyone else and drink cider or wine. But I think over the first 3 months, we saw a total of 50 people. And that included the UPS guy and, a few other non-customers. So it was fairly dismal. We did have a slight uptick in online sales, which was good. But once we were allowed to do tastings, which we did outside on our patio, things picked up a bit.
And now this is January, so
now we're
your
dead
hours
again.
are very limited.
Yeah, we're dead. So quite frankly, I think there are a number of people who may not survive this. I'm hoping we're one of them, but I'm not guaranteeing that.
Wow. So I'm wondering, what would you tell somebody that would be interested in a career in cider making or wine making?
Well, I would really prefer to not give anyone in that situation any advice, because depending on the day, I might tell them to go get a job in the post office instead. And other days, I'd be a little bit more enthusiastic about what I'm doing. So I don't think my advice would be worth much.
Wow. Some people have said, have a lot of startup cash, or
Well, I mean,
financial startup is quite.
There's no getting around it. That I guess the standard joke is, if you want to make a small fortune, start with a large one. And it is true that it's pretty tough to bootstrap it. I think you really just do need adequate funding, or you're probably going to have trouble.
I know you've always had a presence at the Ithaca Farmers Market over the years too. Has that continued, or?
Yeah, again, COVID really hurt that market very seriously. But it's been we initially did it because we thought that would be a good way to promote our products, particularly when you realize that there are many, many people who live in places like Ithaca who will never come out to the wine trail, even though it's 15, 20 miles away. They just don't come out. So if you want to reach them, you've got to go into their market. And the Ithaca Farmers Market is got a great following, and it's worked well for us as a way to promote our products.
Yeah, I know. It's really been a very bad year, and so I hope that things improve for everybody in the market, in the industry, restaurants, and so. Do you have any other thoughts or comments that you'd like to make about, what do you consider one of your greatest achievements in this industry?
Well, I think certainly when we started out, most people didn't know what cider was. And it's not just our achievement, but I think we were certainly a part of it in terms of educating people and helping to create a real industry. So, when I started out, my wife and I started, this room would have been way too big for all the cider makers in the country. And we literally could have had a meeting in a small closet. And now it's pretty much everywhere. If people can grow apples, there's a cider industry there. So I think that would be part of the accomplishment that I share with a lot of other early cider makers, and that we helped to create that.
And you were the first in the area, correct?
Oh yeah,
first on Kegel Lake?
We were the first in the area. We were one of the first in New York State. And New York State is now one of the leading cider producers in the country. But I think when we started out, there was one other guy down in the Hudson Valley that was doing a little bit of cider. And, we got involved very early on with that, and were part of the governor's beverage forums, and we did a lot with the state liquor authority to help them create regulations for this new industry.
So has New York been very helpful to you over the years as far as incentives or?
Well, I think that they've certainly been helpful in that they look at us as a beneficial industry. But it's not like the state has put a huge amount of money behind any of these beverage industries. It's not to say that they haven't put any money, but for example, in trying to open up markets in New York City alone, I know the governor was all excited about providing $1 million for marketing incentives. And then you hear that countries like Spain were spending $17 million on a Christmas promotion alone for their wines. So I'm not sure how to sort of put that into any real perspective, but New York has certainly been interested in what we do, not just the cider industry, but beer, spirits, wine, and they've done a lot to kind of streamline regulations and make it a little bit easier to actually operate. And that's what I would say is probably their biggest contribution.
So that was part of the Farm Winery Act. It's an extension of it, correct?
Yes, yeah. The Farm Winery Act was one of the early initiatives that the state came up with that kicked a lot of it off.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thank you for your time. If you have any other things, I know very early on I saw you listed and featured in some significant national magazines, cooking magazines.
And again,
quite an accomplishment.
Well, but it was also a function of the fact that there wasn't really anybody else doing it. So if an editor at Gourmet or Martha Stewart was thinking about having a cider article or something along those lines, they had very few people to turn to. And we had just enough exposure, certainly locally, but we did some things down in New York City early on. We went to, there was a very interesting farmers market that I would attend down under the Brooklyn Bridge. And so just enough people knew about us, and so we would often get a call if they were looking for somebody to talk to.
Right. Yeah, and Pairings, I know I had seen, I believe you featured for Thanksgiving and
Yes.
Easter pairing ideas. So that was really wonderful.
Yeah, it was fun to get that kind of exposure, and it definitely helped us quite a bit at the time.
Well, I thank you, Bill. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you talking to us and sharing some of the history of cider making. You certainly were a pioneer in the industry, it seems. So thank you for your time. Again, this is Bill Barton from Bellweather Hard Cider and Wine Cellars in Trumansburg, New York. Actually, Covert, correct?
Yeah, we're in Trumansburg mainly because the Interlaken mailman didn't want to come down this far, and he literally just said, "No, I'm not going to deliver there." So fortunately, Trumansburg was willing to do it.
So you're on the Kegel Lake Wine Trail?
Not anymore.
Not anymore, and no. You're on the western shore of Kegel Lake. So it's been very nice talking to you, and I hope things improve with the COVID for everybody at all levels. So thank you for your time. Appreciate you opening up on your closed day.
Well, somebody's got to feed the cat every day, so I'm always here.
All righty. So thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.